What's up, guys? Kino Corner here. Let me ask you all a question. Do you like old movies? I know I do, and I hope you do too. You know, it really annoys me when people say to me that they can't stand to watch black and white films or movies made before X or Y year or movies with subtitles. I remember one time someone told me that they don't watch movies made before the year 2000 because they're just too old. As a guy born in 1994, that didn't make me feel too good. But if you do like these older films, then you should know that if you can watch them today, then a lot of work and care has been put into these movies to keep them alive. It's not enough to just release the movies in the cinemas. No, the film masters have to be kept in a vault under certain conditions, checked on to make sure that things like rot and mold aren't corrupting it, rescanned for new releases, etc. Overall, it's not that cheap. Today, it can feel like we have the entirety of film history at our fingertips. You can go online and log into a streaming service like Netflix, Hulu, the Criterion Channel, Shudder, Peacock, Amazon Prime, Paramount Plus, Tubi, Freevee. Wow, we have a lot of streaming services. Or you can order physical copies from Amazon, eBay, or a multitude of boutique sites. Or you can take to the high seas and get your films in less than legal ways. Really, in the year of our Lord 2024, it's easier to be a cinephile than it ever has been. But what if I told you that many films that we might consider classics, are lost forever? Or what if I told you that many films that we consider masterpieces now were very close to being lost, relegated to becoming footnotes in film history textbooks, never to be seen by modern audiences? Let's take a look at a classic film, a film that occupied the #1 spot on Sight and Sound's best films of all time list. A film that you've probably seen or were made to see in film school. Alfred Hitchcock's Vertigo. Would you believe me if I told you that it's quite possible that Vertigo may not be easy to watch today, but rather exist as a holy grail for lost media fanatics? It wasn't a commercial success. I mean, it broke even, and it did screen off and on in cinemas over the years after its release. I mean, this was before home video existed, so the only way to see movies back then was in the movie theater. Crazy, right? Well, the prints eventually were owned by Hitchcock, and after he died, Universal bought back the rights to show the film theatrically again. Except, there was a problem. The film had faded considerably. The different layers of the film had shrunk, and they didn't have access to the master soundtrack, with the soundtrack on the film reel not being in the best state as it was. Robert Harris and James Katz set about doing whatever they could to save the film. They had to restore the movie to make it look and sound as close as possible to the original 50s version. This restoration process was extensive, as it included coloration, adapting the VistaVision film to 70mm film, and basically creating a whole new soundtrack for the movie. All in all, the process took about 2 years, but if not for them, we might not be able to watch the film today. What would have happened if they had waited to save the movie? Would it have been too far gone? I'm telling you this story because it's not just the super obscure films that are at risk of being lost. Any film that isn't properly taken care of can meet the same fate. Okay, ad time, but don't worry guys, this is a short one. Here at Fudo, we've made our own keyboard for Android phones called Fudo Keyboard. Pretty easy to remember. It's a keyboard that doesn't steal your data, so what you're typing isn't going to be sent off to some server somewhere. We frankly don't care what you're typing. Everything, including the AI-powered voice-to-text and autocorrect features, are handled locally on your phone. So the more you type, the more the keyboard learns your typing habits, and basically, you train your own autocorrect model. This has caused some issues though, especially with the swipe function. Almost all swipe datasets are siloed inside corporations and are typically collected by spying on users' swipes. This has made it challenging to improve the swipe typing on our keyboard. But there is a solution. You. We're reaching out to you guys to help train the swipe dataset. If you go to swipe.fudo.org on your mobile device, you can help train the model and make the typing experience better for everyone. Honestly, it's kind of like playing a game on your phone. I'll leave a link to it in the description below. Now, let's go back to the silent era, which lasted from the late 1800s to 1927. Film was a new technology, a new art form back then. Like many new technologies, there were fervent adopters and other people who weren't quite sure if this was something that would become a cultural mainstay or was just a passing fad. Also, the tech back then was wild, as nothing had been standardized and people were experimenting with motion pictures. There were some weird cameras back then, and there were definitely some unique ways of viewing films. I visited the Film Museum in Frankfurt recently and took a video of a kinetoscope, which was a booth that you could put money into, look through an eyepiece, and watch a short film on loop. It was a wild and adventurous time, filled with advancements in technology, Thomas Edison getting mad at a lot of people, the rise in popularity of this new form of entertainment among the masses, the birth of the first movie stars, the Soviets seeing this art form as the perfect medium for propaganda, and so much more. So wouldn't it be amazing if we could have all these old silent movies on file somewhere so we could properly trace its history? Wouldn't it be awesome to just dive into some deep cuts from this era and see how they made films back then and how the visual storytelling advanced over the years? Well, we can't. I mean, we can to a small extent, but believe it or not, most films from that era are lost. Gone. You can't watch them, they're nowhere to be found. Reading an excerpt from The Survival of American Silent Feature Films, 1912 to 1929 by David Pierce, which was a report funded by the National Film Preservation Board for the Library of Congress, we can read, Mr. Pierce's findings tell us that only 14% of the feature films produced in the United States during the period 1912 to 1929 survive in the format in which they were originally produced and distributed, i.e. as complete works on 35mm film. Another 11% survive in full-length foreign versions or on film formats of lesser image quality such as 16mm and other smaller gauge formats. The report then goes on to say that 75% of all films from that era have been totally lost. I mean, I guess it makes sense since 14 plus 11 is 25, 100 minus 25 is 75, but I'm not here to do high-level math for all of you. But imagine that. 3 out of every 4 films from an entire era of filmmaking gone. So much of the culture of that time is inaccessible to us. Were there silent masterpieces from that time that we'll never see? I'm sure there are. Were many of these lost films probably not that great? Probably yeah, but that doesn't mean that they shouldn't be viewable. So you might be wondering why these movies were lost. They weren't all lost or destroyed for the same reasons. One major factor is the film stock. The film stock used back then was a nitrate film stock, which was highly flammable. It looked beautiful, but it could easily go up in flames. Studios ended up retiring nitrate film in favor of acetate film, which might not have been as visually striking, but was far more stable in the early 1950s. Color Lab, a motion picture film lab in Rockville, Maryland, made a video in which they set fire to different kinds of film stocks earlier this year. Look at how explosive the nitrate film is. Basically, each roll of film was a bomb waiting to go off. If it wasn't kept in perfect conditions and say a spark landed on one roll of film, the whole vault could go up in flames. And up in flames, the vaults went. On July 9, 1937, the Fox Vault in Little Ferry, New Jersey burned down as a result of spontaneous combustion. In 1965, MGM experienced a vault fire, which completely destroyed the only copies of many of their films. The National Archives experienced a vault fire in 1978, which caused the destruction of 28 million feet of newsreels shot between 1929 and 1967. That's documentation of major historical events that are now ash. There were other vault fires and other nitrate film-related fires as well. In 1897, nitrate film and a Lumiere projector caught fire at the Bazaar de la Charité. That fire caused 126 people to die. Nitrate film was nothing to mess with. It was dangerous stuff. But there was another aspect to nitrate film that didn't help its longevity. Nitrate film corrodes really badly. From filmpreservation.org, nitrate degradation is a slow chemical process that occurs because of 2 factors: the nature of the cellulose nitrate plastic itself and the way that film is stored. The lesson from nitrate that applies to all the major deterioration problems is that nurture, a good environment, can win over nature, the inherent rapid degradation of plastics and dyes under poor storage conditions. But good storage conditions have to be put in place before the film becomes too far gone. It's like this film stock just really wants to die. If the films weren't kept in cold storage before they passed the point of no return as far as corrosion goes, then they've been lost. The corrosion of the film can not only cause that individual film to be lost, but the corrosion itself is what has caused many of these fires. From Kodak. Cellulose nitrate decomposition is the villain. It shrinks even to the point of becoming unusable. Furthermore, as the film breaks down, it gives off nitric oxide, nitrogen dioxide, and other gases that yellow the film base, yellow and soften gelatin, and oxidize the silver image. Later, the base cockles, becoming very brittle and then sticky. Finally, it disintegrates completely. This inevitable deterioration is usually gradual, but elevated temperatures and humidity speed it greatly. While it deteriorates, nitrate-based film makes a kind of pressure cooker of the film can in which it rests, especially when it's taped closed. If the gases can't escape, heat builds and spontaneous combustion may not be far behind. Therefore, nitrate film must never be closed in. It's like if one roll of nitrate film wants to go to the afterlife, then it wants to go out in a blaze of glory and take all the other films with it. Now we've got two big reasons why so many films are lost, but we've got a couple more reasons to go. It would be a tragedy if all the films we lost were lost on accident, due to random fires and film degradation. More could have been done to treat the films better, sure, but their destruction was not on purpose. And hey, accidents happen. But many films were destroyed on purpose. Actually, most of these films were purposefully destroyed. You gotta understand that people, studios especially, thought about films differently back then. We think of film as mostly an art form. I mean, I would argue that many films fall under the category of product rather than art, but that's a different discussion. However, back then, films were seen, legally at least, as products. In 1915, in the case Mutual Film Corp versus Industrial Commission of Ohio, the Supreme Court ruled unanimously against Mutual Film Corp, stating that the First Amendment did not apply to films, as film was a business, pure and simple. That led to the possibility of the American government censoring films, and thus the later creation of the Hays Code, which was a way for Hollywood to self-censor so that the government wouldn't step in. But I also think that it shows what the perspective of films was back then. They were products, commodities. Once they outlasted their usefulness, it wasn't a big deal just to get rid of them. Especially after the advent of sound, many studios thought of the silent films as useless, as worthless.
Wait a minute, you ain't heard nothing yet. Wait a minute, I tell you ain't heard nothing.
People wanted to see talkies, not silent movies. What was the point in holding on to films that everyone agreed were worth nothing? And storing movies in vaults isn't cheap. These movie studios were cranking out tons of films every year, and they didn't want to have to keep building more vaults to hold their back catalogs. Therefore, the most financially sound decision for them at the time was for them to junk the movies. They did this in a couple different ways. Studios would usually recycle the film, extracting the silver from the celluloid and selling it for a profit. They'd also sell off the prints of the films to people and also to toy companies to use in little movie projectors, which would show cut-down scenes in movies that had finished their theatrical run. I want to say, though, that I think this reason accounts for way less films lost than the studios recycling their old films. Funnily enough, these clippings used for toy projectors have preserved the memories of many lost films. Recently, some footage from the previously thought entirely lost film Cleopatra was found, and many believe that the film clips were used in one of those toy projectors. It might seem like nobody cared about film's longevity during this period, but that's not true. Charlie Chaplin famously fought to preserve his movies, which is why the scans of his films today are so good. In France, Henry Langlois also made great efforts to keep films alive. He collected film prints during the 30s and kept those prints safe during German occupation in World War II, cementing him as a pioneer of film preservation. But it wasn't until the 1950s that there was a change in the general thinking about film. For one, the 50s saw the boom of television.
All you have to do is turn that dial and you have all the company you want, right there on the screen.
No longer did people have to go to the cinemas to watch episodic shorts, news, or movies. Television, paired with the 1948 Supreme Court ruling for United States versus Paramount, plunged the Hollywood studio system into chaos and effectively ended what we call the golden age of cinema. Even so, television allowed film and visual media in general to become more decentralized. Television stations could fill up airtime by playing older movies. So now, films could find a life after their theatrical runs had long ended. Thus, there was financial incentive to keep more films alive. One famous example of a movie becoming popular because of TV is It's a Wonderful Life. We all know it as a Christmas classic, but in reality, it was a box office bomb. What worked in its favor was that its copyright ended in 1974, so TV stations could play it without having to pay licensing fees or royalties to the studios. Since it was basically free, they played it all the time, and its airtime elevated it from a forgotten Capra to possibly his most famous film. The other major sea change that happened in the 40s and 50s was that people were starting to see films as pieces of art. The French cinephiles at Cahiers du Cinéma wrote extensively on film, treating film criticism not as product reviews, but as actual art criticism. It was the French, Nino Frank in particular, for the publication L'Écran Français, who coined the term film noir, which prompted people to treat the hard-boiled and mostly B-movies of the 30s and 40s much more seriously. Adding to that, in 1952, the Supreme Court overturned Mutual Film Corp versus Industrial Commission of Ohio in their decision for Joseph Burstyn Inc. versus Wilson. The Supreme Court found that film actually was an artistic medium and thus protected by the First Amendment. You might think that this was brought on by some slightly edgy big studio film, but you would be wrong. The film that prompted this court case was a short film by the legendary Italian director Roberto Rossellini called The Miracle. It was found to be sacrilegious and sexually suggestive, but it was allowed to show because a court decision finally allowed filmmakers this little thing that we like to call free speech. Lastly, in 1942, the Library of Congress started housing copies of the films that were copyrighted, ensuring that even if the studios lost their copies of their movies, the movies would be preserved by the government. You might have thought that the Library of Congress had been keeping copies of films before that, but no, they weren't. They didn't want those nitrate movies in their archives. So if the studios lost their copies of the films they made before 1942, then, well, they were totally gone. So these new laws, technologies, practices, and cultural attitudes contributed a lot to keeping films alive. And over time, things would just get better. Home video, such as the VHS Betamax tape, Laserdisc, and later DVDs and Blu-rays, would ensure that consumers could have copies of their films in their homes. It also opened a market in which companies would restore older films and re-release them on home video. Companies like Criterion, Arrow, Blue Underground, Massacre Video, Vinegar Syndrome, and Kino Lorber do just this. There's also the Film Foundation, and the Film Foundation's whole purpose is the preservation of cinema. I absolutely love what they're doing, and I try to support them whenever I can.
Préserver la mémoire contribue à préserver la culture. Qu'une culture sans mémoire est une culture morte.
While we're talking about these companies and organizations who are doing the Lord's work, I want to tell you all a brief story. My friend Lewis, who runs Massacre Video, bought the rights to the film The Amazing Mr. No Legs. You might have heard about this on Red Letter Media's Best of the Worst.
This is a disgusting 70s movie.
The most disgusting 70s movie.
The most disgusting 70s movie ever made.
He needed a copy of the film to scan for his release, so he reached out to the producer. The master negative was gone, and the CRI, which is a print of the negative, was destroyed in a hurricane. But the producer assured him that he had several prints at his place in Florida. Lewis then traveled to Florida to collect the prints. There was a problem. The prints were not kept in a good environment. Oh no. They were kept in a truck trailer for God knows how long. Decades, maybe? You know, film doesn't like heat or humidity, and so I can't think of a worse place to store film than in a tin box in the middle of Florida. When he opened the cans of film, he told me that all he found was dust. Now, a video master did exist to the movie as it had a home video release, so it wasn't at risk of being lost forever, but he didn't want to just release a scan of the VHS, which VHSs are also prone to degrading over time. He sought out a copy of the actual film, and he did find one. A cinema owner in France had saved a theatrical print. That was good enough. It was scratchy and old, but hey, it beats dust. To show a more famous example, Criterion restored, or rather resurrected, Satyajit Ray's The Apu Trilogy, which had been thought to have been lost in a nitrate fire for decades. The restoration of that was super extensive, but the end product is nothing short of amazing. I'll leave a link to videos on that restoration process in the description below. Basically, there's financial incentive for these companies to save and restore films. Plus, saving movies is getting cheaper over time. I'm not going to say that it's an easy process. It isn't. But it is much more doable now than it's ever been. Now, that's not to say that things are perfect, because they aren't. Physical media sales are on a decline, with boutique distributors marketing more towards collectors than wider audiences nowadays. That might harm the financial incentive in the preservation of movies. Also, many films are going straight to streaming. I fear that this puts the movies in precarious positions, as they can be pulled from the streaming platforms at any moment, and they might not exist anywhere else. We also have a problem in which studios are destroying films before they even release them. We saw that quite recently with Coyote vs. Acme and Batgirl. Also, some companies like Disney intentionally try to memory hold their older films, such as Song of the South, for various reasons. I'd say that the most common reason for studios to not restore older films in their catalogs, though, is that they simply don't care enough. They'll make more money from their newer films than from their older films. It's sad, but it does make sense. I know some people argue and say, but the high seas exist. That's true, but there's an issue with that. If you're looking for a movie that's not well known, you might not be able to find it, or if you do, there might not be any seeders. In that case, you'll have to go to a private site or try to find a copy of the film from your network of cinephile friends. As good as things are today, though, films are still at risk of being destroyed or lost. Many countries outside the US don't have the funds or good facilities to store their movies. Laws and rights work differently elsewhere, and let's face it, rights can be really complicated. There are a ton of nations with rich histories of film that might be disintegrating this very second. Just last year, Tokyo Laboratory announced it was going to destroy 20,000 films in its stock by last October. I'm not a Japanese lawyer, but it seems like they couldn't offload it to third parties because Japanese copyright law states that only the rights holders can reclaim the films. Problem is, they had a very difficult time contacting any of these rights holders, so if no one who owned those films reclaimed them, then the laboratory had to destroy the prints. Thankfully, there's a happy ending to this story. The legendary Japanese studio Toho somehow managed to save those films, and now those movies are being housed in the Toho archive. So while things are getting better to ensure that our film culture continues to live on, there's still a lot of work to do. As long as movies are being made, then there will always be more and more movies to take proper care of. What can we do? Well, I think the easiest thing for us to do is to financially support restored films. That gives the companies incentive to continue their preservation of our cultural history. I'm guessing also that some of you might be lost media collectors, and hey, I'm all for it even if I don't have the time or energy for that. But who knows? Maybe one of you will be the person to find that long-lost copy of London After Midnight. I know that there's way more to this topic that I can cover in a single video, but I just wanted to give a brief overview into the history of film preservation so that people can appreciate how important it is. I hate to hear about films being lost to time, and the fact that something like half of all films made before 1950 being lost saddens me. I mean, watching a film from 100 years ago is a wild experience. It lets you step into a totally different time, and it's not unlike time travel in a way. It's not just about preserving movies. It's about preserving culture, language, music, fashion, artistry, and the memories of all those people who built and contributed to the art form that we so dearly love. I've been the Kino Corner, and I will see you all in the next video.